She had nowhere to go and 1 hour before sunrise. Then she remembered. The door had been shut behind her while the house still slept inside. 14 rooms, 6 with roofs, and a locked door upstairs waiting. Her own name, written in a stranger's hand 40 years before. The door of Ashcombe House shut behind her at 10 minutes to 6, and Margaret Vance didn't even wait to hear it latch. Eleanor stood on the gravel with her hands clasped low in front of her, the way she always stood, back straight, chin level, and she turned the small brass key on its loop of black ribbon once around her wrist. That was the only motion she made. 6 weeks a widow. One valise she wasn't allowed to keep. A thin charcoal gray wool traveling coat, patched at the right elbow with a square of mismatched black cloth, because she'd mended it herself 2 winters back, and Margaret had called it common at the table in front of guests. Let's be clear about what happened in that hallway. Margaret Vance, 61 years old, ivory skin powdered like a scone, iron gray hair pulled into that smooth coil at the nape that never moved even in wind, had stood in her stiff black bombazine with the jet buttons up to the throat and touched the oval mourning brooch at her collar. She always touches it before she says something vile, watch for it, and delivered this. You are a convenience, not a Vance. Take your coat and be grateful I've let you have that. She said it the way you'd tell a dog to get off the furniture. No breakfast, no cab, no forwarding of the letters that had been arriving for Eleanor since the funeral. Margaret had those in a drawer, and we'll come back to them. The estate went to a cousin in Bath. The furniture Eleanor had polished, the linens she'd counted, the sick room she'd sat in for 11 weeks while her husband coughed himself out of the world, none of it hers. Margaret made sure of that with a solicitor who studied the carpet whenever Eleanor entered the room. So she walked. 4 miles, frozen, the road ruts hard as iron under cracked black ankle boots, one lace knotted where it had broken and never been replaced. Her cheekbones went pink in the cold the way they always did, and the loose auburn strands at her temples stiffened with frost. Down through the village at 6:30, past the bakers with the fire already lit, past the Hartleys, past the church, past every house where she'd handed over jars of preserves and sat at bedsides during the fever year. Curtains moved, that's all. A twitch at the Miller cottage, a shadow behind glass at the Poltons. Old Ned Barrow with his lamp in the doorway of the forge, who looked right at her, and looked away, and shut the door. Nobody opened a thing. Not a door, not a mouth. 12 houses and not one damn word. She didn't hurry. She has this walk, deliberate, unhurried, like the road belongs to her and she's simply choosing not to hurry across it. Gray-green eyes forward. The freckles across her nose stood out sharper the colder she got. And somewhere past the last cottage, with the sun still under the hill, she remembered Hollowcroft. Everyone knew Hollowcroft. 14 rooms on the ridge above the beck, put up by the Ashe family in the last century, and left to sit empty for 19 years after old Constance Ashe died in the front bedroom with the door locked from the inside. It went to auction in the spring of the 2nd year. The auctioneer opened at £50, then 20, then 5, then, with the room laughing, 3, and it was knocked down to a Vance solicitor's clerk for £3 because the estate wanted the ledger closed, and nobody, not one farmer, not one speculator, wanted a house with a hole in its roof and a story about a locked door. That deed had come to Eleanor's husband. It was worth so little it hadn't been worth taking off her. Margaret had actually laughed when she signed it over. Let her have the ruin, it suits her, and handed across the brass key on its black ribbon like she was tipping a servant. That key was on Eleanor's wrist right now. She came up the lane at first light and stopped at the gate. The east roof was gone. Not damaged, gone. A black gap of open rafters like ribs, slates scattered in the long grass where they'd slid off over 19 winters. Ivy had taken the whole north face and gone in through 2 windows. The chimney stack on the west end leaned 4 inches off true. Guttering hung loose and swung. And in the far corner of what had been a garden, against the south wall where the frost couldn't reach, a wild rose hedge was still blooming. Late, ragged, half-brown, but blooming in the last week of October because nobody had trimmed it and nobody had killed it either. She stood at that gate a long moment. Then she opened it, and the smell came down to meet her. Wet lime, cold soot, the green rot of standing water, and under it something dry and sweet, like old paper. If you've ever wondered what a person does when the world has finished with her, she counts. Eleanor went through that house room by room in the gray light and counted it like an inventory clerk. 14 rooms. The east wing, 4 rooms open to the sky, floorboards spongy, plaster ceilings down in sheets, a bird's nest in the fireplace of what had been a dining room. The scullery ceiling buckled in the middle, sagging like a wet sail, one good push from coming down. 11 windows broken or gone. The morning room let rain. She could see the tide mark on the wall, a brown wave line 18 inches up. The library let light, gold and clean through south glass that had somehow survived, dust turning over in it. 6 rooms habitable if you were generous. 2 rooms with an intact roof if you weren't. Upstairs, the 4th bedroom on the west corridor was dry. Genuinely dry. Plaster sound, board floor solid, a bedstead with no mattress and a wardrobe with the doors shut. 19 years and not one drop had got into it. She put her palm flat on that wall and held it there. And the kitchen. The kitchen was cold enough to hurt, but the great iron range squatted under its arch with the flue clear enough to let a draft up, and when she opened the firebox and struck her palm against the plate, the sound was solid. It would draw. 19 years, and the thing would still draw. She stood in that kitchen with her hands clasped low and did the arithmetic. No money, no food, no coal, a roof half gone and a winter coming. Then she went back to the landing, because of the door. Upper floor, east end, at the turn of the stair, a plain oak door with no handle, only an iron escutcheon and a keyhole. Painted shut, then painted again. The paint over the frame was unbroken all the way round, which meant nobody had opened it since it was last painted, and it hadn't been painted since Constance Ashe was alive. Eleanor untied the black ribbon and fitted the brass key to the hole. It went in a 1/4 inch and stopped. Wrong key. Wrong lock entirely. She looked at that door for a very long time. Then she came back down, put her shoulder against the swollen front door where the damp had jammed it, and shoved it wide with a crack that echoed through 14. The cat didn't move. Not when the door groaned shut behind her. Not when she set her one bag down on flagstones furred with 19 years of dust. It just sat on the cold iron range, thin as a folded glove, watching her with the patience of something that had been waiting a very long time and had decided she'd do. Eleanor Vance looked at it. It looked back. Neither of them blinked first, and neither of them cared. She got to work, because that's what you do when you've got no money, no help, and no plan beyond not freezing. There was kindling in a basket by the hearth, old, dry, probably older than her marriage. There was a scuttle of coal gone to dust and clinker. She twisted paper, laid the sticks in a lattice the way her father taught her before the family decided she was an inconvenience with a surname, and struck a match against the range door. The fire caught. Beautiful, orange, alive. For about 90 seconds it was the best thing that had happened to her in a year. Then the smoke came back down. Not a wisp. A wall. It rolled out of the firebox and off the top plate in a gray shove that filled the kitchen chest high in the time it took her to say a word she wouldn't repeat in company. Her eyes streamed, her throat closed. The freckles across her nose were black with soot before she got the door open, and she stood in the yard bent double, coughing into the patched elbow of that thin charcoal coat, while the house exhaled 19 years of stored filth out of every window she'd cracked. The cat walked out past her ankles at a stroll, not panicked, just done with the room. Here's what she didn't know yet, and what the house wasn't going to tell her politely. A flue cap open to the sky for 2 decades is not a chimney. It's an apartment building. Jackdaws had been stacking sticks in that stack since before she was married, layer on layer, packed with feather and mud and the bones of things that hadn't made it out. The fire had nowhere to go, so it came back to her. Failure number 1, 11 minutes into ownership. She didn't cry about it. She scraped the fire out with a shovel, carried the coals into the yard, and let them die on wet gravel. Then she went upstairs and found the one room where the roof had held, the small east bedroom over the scullery, plaster dry, a window with all its glass, a smell of dust instead of rot. 14 rooms in Hollowcroft, 6 even pretending to be habitable, 2 with roofs you'd trust. This was the best one, and it had a bed frame with no mattress. She slept on the floorboards in her coat, with her traveling bag under her head and the small brass key on its loop of black ribbon still tied at her wrist. The cat came up around midnight, didn't ask, settled against her spine like it had done it 1,000 times. Morning, half a heel of bread and a paper of cold bacon, which was the entirety of her food. She ate a third of it and put the rest down on the flagstones. The cat took it without hurry, the way you take what's owed. She didn't name it. Naming a thing is a promise, and she wasn't handing out promises yet, not with the arithmetic she was carrying. And then the house gave her the first piece. She was on her knees at the kitchen hearth, working out where the smoke had scorched the lintel, and her hand went down on a hearthstone that rocked. Just a fraction. That soft, betraying tilt a stone makes when the mortar's been picked out and put back by hand. Not fallen out. Picked. She got her fingers into the seam and lifted, and it came up in one clean square, and underneath, in a cavity dry as a biscuit tin, sat a leather journal wrapped in oilcloth. The cover was soft with handling. Inside the front board, in brown iron gall ink, a date, 1847. She read the first page by the gray window light with her hair coming loose from its low knot at the temple, and it was nothing. Household accounts, candles, 3 shillings, lime, 4 bushels, and then, halfway down, in the same hand, paid Holloway's roof, not to be entered in the estate book. Not to be entered. Somebody had been keeping 2 sets of numbers in this house, and only one of them was for the family. She was still holding it when the gate hinge cried out down at the end of the drive. A man was coming up through the wet grass with a worn leather tool roll under one arm, the strap dark with years of handling. Tall, 6 foot and a bit, broad in the shoulder, heavy through the forearms, fawn canvas work coat with the collar turned up, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hobnailed boots caked with pale lime dust. He walked like a man who had never once hurried and had never once been late either. He looked at the smoke stains smeared up the outside of the chimney stack, black and fresh. He looked at her. "Jackdaws," he said. 4 syllables and a diagnosis, from a stranger who hadn't been within 30 feet of the fire. Thomas Reed set a ladder against the gable, his ladder, brought up from somewhere he didn't mention, and went up the roof slope like it was a stair he used daily. She heard the scrape of a brush shaft, then the long, dry rush of debris coming down the flue and out into the firebox in a heap that filled 2 coal scuttles. Sticks. Mud plugs. 19 years of nesting compressed into a cork. He came down with soot in the creases of his hands, the faint reddish birthmark at the base of his left thumb showing pale through the grime, and said nothing whatsoever about money. She laid the fire again that afternoon. Paper, kindling, the last decent coal. It drew. You could hear it, that low, steady pull up the stack, the flame leaning in instead of out, air moving the right direction for the first time since 1868. The range plate warmed. The kitchen smelled of hot iron and burning wood instead of damp. The cat came in from the yard, jumped up, and lay down on the warm metal where it had been sitting cold the day before, and Eleanor stood with her hands flat on the rail and let her cheekbones flush pink from the heat. 2 days later, Agnes Holloway came up the drive, stooped over a knobbed blackthorn stick with a brass ferrule worn silver, carrying a wrapped rose cutting in her apron. She looked at the beech hedge along the south wall a long moment. "Your grandmother planted that hedge the year you were born," she said. "Told me you'd come eventually." Eleanor didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer that fit. That night she wrote to the solicitor in York asking one plain question about title. She walked it to the post herself. No reply came. Not that week. Not the next. But on the Thursday, Thomas Reed shimmed the sagging scullery door frame with 4 oak wedges, rehung it on its own hinges, and swung it shut so cleanly the latch clicked. "Beams sound underneath," he said. Then he walked off without once explaining how he knew. Thomas Reed's boots crunch away down the drive, hobnails biting gravel, lime dust ghosting off the heels, and behind him the door swings and settles into its frame with a sound Eleanor hasn't heard in that house since she arrived. A clean, dry click. No scrape, no shove of the shoulder, just a door doing what a door is meant to do. She stands there in the thin charcoal gray coat with the black patch at the right elbow, the brass key on its black ribbon knocking gently at her wrist, and she opens it and closes it 4 times. Because she can. The next morning brings a carriage. Henry Caldwell doesn't knock. Men like Caldwell never knock. They arrive, and the building is expected to notice. He plants himself in the hall, thumbs hooked in his waistcoat, chest forward, rocking slow on those polished black boots, and he draws out that heavy gold watch chain and consults it like time itself owes him money. He looks at the buckled ceiling. He looks at her boots, cracked black leather, one lace knotted where it broke. He smiles. "I'm not here for the house," he says. "The house is firewood with ambition. I'm here for the land." The offer is reasonable. That's what makes it poison. Enough to live on for 2 years, comfortably, in rooms with a roof that doesn't drip. He lays it out on the hall table with the confidence of a man who's watched 100 desperate people sign 100 sensible papers, and every one of them thanked him afterward. Then he ruins it, because his kind always ruins it. Be practical, Mrs. Vance. You've no money, no name left worth the ink, and no notion what a drain even is. You're a girl playing house in a corpse. Take the money and go be somebody's guest somewhere warm. A girl playing house in a corpse. Remember that line. He'll eat it later. Margaret Vance comes in behind him, small clipped steps, rigid, hands folded at the waist, black bombazine buttoned to the throat, and her fingers go straight to the oval jet brooch the way they always do before she says something designed to draw blood. "A widow cannot hold an estate," she says. "It isn't done. My son married beneath him and died of it. Don't compound the embarrassment." Eleanor's cheekbones flush pink in the cold hall. She doesn't answer. Straight back, chin level, hands clasped low in front. She simply walks past both of them and opens the front door, and it swings clean and quiet on its new set frame, and she holds it. That's the whole reply. The door works. Get out. Caldwell leaves the paper on the table. They always leave the paper. By noon, she's in the cellar with a bucket. 11 inches of standing water. Black, skinned with a film of oil and lime, cold enough to burn the ankles, smelling of iron and drowned mortar, and something older underneath. The smell of a room that's been holding its breath since before she was born. The stair down is narrow, 4 stone treads and then brick, and the ceiling beam over it is low enough that Thomas Reed ducks without thinking when he comes down at 2 o'clock with the leather tool roll under one arm and a second bucket in his fist. He doesn't explain. He never explains. They work. Bucket, climb, tip into the yard, climb back. 11 inches down to 9. 9 down to 6. Her arms shake by the 4th hour, and she doesn't stop, and he sees it and doesn't say a word about it, which is the only kindness that would have been tolerable. Auburn hair comes loose at her temple and sticks to her cheek. The scatter of freckles across her nose disappears under grime. His forearms are wet to the elbow, sleeves rolled, that faint reddish birthmark at the base of his left thumb going white each time he grips the handle. By dark, the cellar floor is bare brick and the water is a memory. She sleeps with her hands cramped shut. At dawn, it's back. 11 inches. Every damn one of them. That's the failure. That's the information. Thomas arrives, looks at the level line on the wall, goes out into the yard, and lies flat in the mud with a length of string and a stone. 10 minutes. Then he comes back to the cellar mouth, and this is one of the few times he uses more than 4 words. Drain channel runs uphill, he says, toward the yard. Somebody regraded that ground 40 years back and never checked. Water's been coming in through the outfall, not going out. We cut a new fall to the ditch, 18 inches over 30 feet. She'll run dry and stay dry. They cut it. 2 days, pickaxe and spade, a trench angled to the boundary ditch, the last 6 feet lined with broken slate off the collapsed stable roof, because good stone is free when your house is already falling down. Water finds the fall. Water goes. 3rd morning, dry brick. Not damp, dry. And here's where the story stops being about a house. Because that night, by candle, she reads further into the journal from behind the loose stone, and the entries stop being weather and prices and start being names. 1847. A payment of £11 marked, for the Holloway roof, not to be spoken of. £9. Seed money, Barrow's Field, forgive at his death. £22 a year for 6 years. Schooling, the mason's daughter. She is clever and no one else will pay. Page after page. Decades of it. A quiet woman in a cold house handing out sums she couldn't spare, and writing beside every one of them the same instruction. Tell no one. That's the pivot. A cracked door frame, a blocked drain, a little book behind a stone. Small noise. And underneath it, running for 40 years beneath a village that thought this place was just a ruin with a mad woman in it. An entire hidden economy of mercy. Unrecorded, uncollected, undefended. Small noise. Catastrophic scale. Eleanor sits with the candle guttering and understands finally why Caldwell wants the land so badly and pretends the house is worthless. Nobody fights that hard for firewood with ambition. She goes down the cellar stair with the candle at midnight because she cannot sleep, and Thomas is already there. He'd stayed to check the trench in the rain. The stair is narrow. She reaches for the low beam to steady herself, and his hand is already on it, and hers lands over his, knuckle to knuckle, cold on warm. Neither of them moves for 1 full second. Neither of them mentions it. Ever. He steps back. She goes down, and her candle, held low now, catches something the 11 inches of black water had hidden for 40 years. A stretch of sodden brickwork on the north wall that isn't brick at all, just brick-painted board, swollen and split and hanging loose off its nails since the day the flood came in. She pulls it away with 2 fingers. Behind it, a sealed iron chest, squat and black with rust bloom. And lying on the lid, wrapped in oilcloth gone soft as skin, the missing key to the upper room. The candle flame steadied over the iron chest and the key lying on top of it, and Eleanor didn't touch either one. That's the part people get wrong about her. She stood in 11 inches of cold cellar water with the hem of her dove-gray dress heavy as wet rope, and she looked at that key the way you look at a door you're not sure you want opened. Then she climbed back up and put the key on the kitchen table, and she sat down with the other thing on that table. Caldwell's offer. Here's the arithmetic, and I want you to actually do it with her, because this is the night the whole story could have ended. 14 rooms, 6 habitable, 2 roofs intact. The west slates were gone past patching. Thomas had said it plain. That ridge wants stripping and relaying, not nursing, and that's 40 pounds of slate before a man lifts a hammer. Lime at 9p the bushel, lath by the 100, a chimney relined, a cellar drain recut so it ran downhill instead of the idiot direction some Georgian mason had run it. Add it. She did, 3 times in pencil, on the back of a butcher's bill. 211 pounds, give or take. She had 9 pounds 4 shillings and a brass key on a loop of black ribbon at her wrist. And on the table sat Henry Caldwell's paper, generous in the way a trap is generous, and his voice sitting on top of it like grease. He'd stood in that hallway 2 days before with his thumbs hooked in his waistcoat, rocking on his heels, drawing that fat, polished gold watch chain out and consulting it like her existence was costing him money. "Let's be adult about it, Mrs. Vance. You're a widow with a patched coat and no capital. This estate ate men with money. What in God's name do you imagine it'll do to a girl with none? Sign, take the 90 pounds, and go be somebody's poor relation where you belong." He said girl to a woman of 26 who'd buried a husband and been thrown out by his mother in the same week. The candle burned down to a stub. Rain came through the east passage and found the bucket she'd left for it. The cat, thin, patient, the one that had been waiting in that kitchen longer than anybody, came and sat on the corner of the offer like it was a cushion, and she moved it gently and picked up the pen. She actually picked up the pen. Nib touched paper. There was ink on the page. And then she put it down and took the key instead and went up the stairs. The upper room, the one at the end of the north corridor with the lock that fit nothing she owned, that she'd pushed at for 6 weeks. The brass key on the black ribbon went in, and the wards turned like they'd been oiled last Tuesday. 40 years shut, and the mechanism was sweet as new, because somebody had cared for it, right up until she couldn't. Dry in there. That's the first thing. Bone dry, dust an inch deep, and the roof over that one room perfect, because the woman who sealed it had spent good money making sure of exactly that. A desk, a bank of deed boxes, 9 ledgers. Eleanor set the candle down and opened the first one, and her hands, which had not shaken while she signed away her husband's house, or while Margaret Vance told her to be gone by Friday, shook then. It wasn't one secret, it was 40 years of them. A trust, lodged at Fenwick's in York, £4,200, laid down in 1847, 3% untouched, compounding through 4 decades while the roof over her head rotted. And beside it, the loan book. Line after line in the same slanted hand. £12 to J. Holloway, roof, not to be repaid. 30 to the smith at Weatherby, forge rebuilt after the fire, not to be repaid. School fees, 9 years, for a girl in the village whose name Eleanor didn't know. A widow's rent, paid quietly for 11 years running. 63 entries, not one of them called in. Every single one marked with the same 3 words in the margin. Say nothing of it. That old woman had sat in a house with buckets under the ceilings and given the county its lives back, 1 line at a time, and let them all think she was a miser going soft in the dark. And under the ledgers, in the second deed box, a will, dated after the one the family waved around. Witnessed, sealed, and naming, not a nephew, not the Vances, not Caldwell's client, a granddaughter. Now, if you've come this far, stay right where you are, because what she found in the third box is the reason I wanted to tell you this at all. Letters, tied in ribbon gone the color of weak tea, and in them, over and over, a name Eleanor had been told since infancy was a scandal not to be spoken, her mother's. Sent away at 19, married off fast and far, and then, in a stranger's careful hand on a half-sheet of paper, a birth recorded. A daughter, auburn-haired, born in the spring, and the note beneath it. She is not to be told, but she is to be provided for. Eleanor Vance was not a stranger who'd been dumped in a ruin as a joke. She was the blood. She'd been hidden from her own grandmother by the family that raised her, and that family had signed her into this house as a punishment, never dreaming it was the only thing they'd ever failed to steal. She sat down on the floor of that dry room with her back against the desk, and she laughed until it turned into something else. Thomas found her there at 7 the next morning because he came Thursdays and he'd said he would. He stood in the doorway with the leather tool roll under his arm and pale lime dust on those hobnailed boots, and he looked at the open ledgers a long time. "That's my father's name," he said. "Page 2, 1851. She paid off the debt that would have taken our land and told him if he ever mentioned it she'd deny every word. 1 sentence, and 6 weeks of him knowing which beam was sound and where the estate ledger was kept came apart into something simple. He hadn't been circling the house. He'd been paying it back. Caldwell moved fast. He'd have moved faster if he'd known, but he was busy being certain, and certain men are slow. He filed to force a sale on the grounds the title was clouded and the occupant insolvent. And he had the sheriff's notice nailed to the gatepost by Monday with his own initials on the corner, which tells you everything about the man's soul. Eleanor read it. Straight-backed, chin level, hands clasped low, that thin charcoal coat patched at the elbow doing nothing at all against the wind. Then she wrapped 9 ledgers and 2 documents in oilcloth, and she walked into town. And in the solicitor's office, she laid the second will and the trust ledger flat on the green baize table, and asked Henry Caldwell to read the name on page 4. Page 4 had one line on it that mattered, and Henry Caldwell read it out loud because a room full of witnesses was watching him, and there was nowhere left to hide behind that gold watch chain. Caldwell, Josiah, and Son, timber and haulage, advanced against the Hollowcroft estate account, March 1861, £480. Never called in, never repaid. His father's name, his father's debt. Sitting in a trust ledger kept in a copperplate hand by a woman he'd spent 6 months calling a sentimental old fool who let a good property rot out of spite. The solicitor read the rest because Eleanor asked him to, and she asked once, plainly, and did not raise her voice. The second will, dated the 11th of October, witnessed by 2 tenants and a curate, leaving Hollowcroft and everything under its roof to the granddaughter of the woman who signed it. The trust, £4,200, laid down in 1848, compounding quietly at 3%, drawn on twice a year for 40 years, and never once for the family that assumed it didn't exist. 22 loans out of it, 11 never called back in, and the 11th, the largest, the one with the fattest interest column running down the page like a bill nobody thought would ever arrive. Caldwell. He reached for the watch chain, pulled it out, looked at the dial like the time might have changed something. It hadn't. This is the man who stood in her hallway 6 months earlier, rocking on his heels with his thumbs hooked in his waistcoat, and told her, and I want you to hear it exactly as he said it, "A woman with no money and no name doesn't hold land, Mrs. Vance. She just delays the sale and makes it uglier. Take the £60. It's more than you've got and more than you're worth. £60. For a 14-room estate sitting on a trust that could buy him twice over." He put his hand over his mouth. Not dramatic, just a man doing arithmetic he'd avoided his whole life, and finding out the answer had his surname on it. Nobody spoke. The clock on the mantel did all the talking for about 11 seconds. And if you've ever wanted to know what winning sounds like, it isn't shouting. It's a rich man breathing through his fingers in a room that has stopped pretending to be on his side. That silence was the victory. Eleanor didn't add a word to it. She stood there in the thin, charcoal gray traveling coat with the mismatched black patch at the right elbow, chin level, hands clasped low, the small brass key still looped on black ribbon at her wrist, and let the ledger finish the sentence she'd never needed to start. Margaret Vance rose before the solicitor had gathered the deed boxes. Rigid, spare, iron-gray hair coiled smooth at the nape, small, clipped steps to the door. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't say anything. At the threshold, she lifted one hand and touched the oval jet brooch at her throat, the same gesture she made every time she'd called Eleanor an embarrassment, a burden, a girl who married above herself and had the poor taste to survive it. This time she touched it with nothing to say after. That was the last anyone at Hollowcroft ever saw of her. Then came the weeks, and the weeks were the strange part. Firewood appeared at the gate on a Tuesday. 8 feet of split ash, stacked square. No note. On the Friday, a roofer from Thirsk came up the lane with a cart of reclaimed Westmoreland slate and said, before he said hello, "Your grandmother roofed my mother's cottage in the bad winter. Wouldn't take a penny." He unloaded it himself. Wouldn't take a penny either. A mason arrived in October, 71 years old, with his son doing the lifting. He'd borrowed £11 in 1861 to bury his wife. He put £11 on the kitchen table in coin, and when Eleanor pushed it back, he pushed it forward again, and pointed at the crumbling east chimney stack and said he'd work it off instead. And he did, for 3 weeks. in the rain. Agnes Holloway came stooped over the knobbed blackthorn stick with its worn brass ferrule, both hands on it, brown shawl pinned with pewter, and set a rose cutting wrapped in wet sacking on the step. "Your grandmother planted those the year you were born," she said. "She told me you'd come eventually." One sentence, 72 years of keeping it. They kept coming. A carter, a schoolmistress whose fees had been paid by someone who never signed the receipts, a widow with a jar of honey, and a story about a doctor's bill in 1874. Not one person remembering, a dozen, then 20. That's not sentiment, that's evidence, and it was walking up the lane in muddy boots week after week. The work itself was slow and filthy and beautiful. The damp plaster in the long west corridor came off the wall in wet sheets down to the lath, and the lath came off too where the rot had gone through, and Thomas Reed cut new riven oak strips and nailed them up with the tool roll open on the floor beside him, sleeves shoved to the elbow, forearms white to the wrist with lime. First mix went on too wet and crazed overnight into a map of hairline cracks. Second mix, stiffer, hair-gauged, 3 coats with days between, held, still holding. The east roof went on in November, slate by slate, and the kitchen range drew clean the whole time because the flue cap had finally been cleared of 40 years of jackdaw nesting. The garden got cut back to the bones, and under all that bramble the roses were exactly where Agnes said they'd be, and they had never once stopped blooming. Nobody had watched them do it. They did it anyway. The staircase was last. 14 new balusters, a rail sanded and waxed until it ran smooth as a river stone from the bottom newel to the landing. Eleanor put her hand on it to test it. Thomas put his over hers. That was all. 3 seconds, maybe. Hands that had hauled the same beams, mixed the same lime, argued twice about whether the pantry wall was load-bearing. It wasn't, and he was right, and he never mentioned it again. He didn't say anything, neither did she. The rail held both of them, which was rather the point. 2 winters on, the house is warm, and it is not grand. 6 rooms lived in, the rest honest. Patched plaster shows lighter than the old where the repairs went in, and nobody's painted over the seam, because those scars are part of the building now. The gray cat that was waiting thin in the kitchen the first morning is enormous and asleep on the range plate, and has opinions about anyone who moves her. In February, a woman came up the lane with a valise and stopped at the gate, the way people do when they've been turned away enough times to expect it. Eleanor opened the door, didn't ask her name, didn't ask what happened, just stepped back and let the heat come out into the cold. Here's the thing about Hollowcroft. The trust was never the inheritance. Neither was the deed, or the slate, or the 480 pounds that broke Henry Caldwell's smug little rocking stance in a solicitor's office.